You know, there's a particular quality to the light on a Sunday morning. It filters through the stained glass of an old church, not just illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but seeming to carry the weight of every prayer, every hymn, every whispered confession that has ever echoed off those stone walls. For 68 years, I've watched that light paint shifting jewels across the pews of St. Jude. It's saying I was baptized in that light, married in it, and I mourned my darling Robert in it. I have always believed that in a place so sacred, the light could hold no shadows. I was wrong. The darkest shadows are often cast by those who claim to be the source of the light itself. My name is Jillian, and this is the story of how I had to evict my own pastor from my own church right in the middle of his sermon. He thought he was blackmailing a vulnerable old woman. He had no idea he was trying to extort his landlord. It began, as so many profound mistakes do, with an act of faith. Reverend Michael Davies had been with us at St. Jude's for about 3 years. He arrived on a wave of enthusiasm, a handsome man in his late 40s with a voice like warm honey and a smile that seemed to reach the back pews. He was a stark contrast to old Reverend Thomas, who smelled of mothballs and spoke of damnation. Michael spoke of community, of vision, of moving St. Jude's into the 21st century. At first we were all charmed. His energy was infectious. Attendance swelled. The collection plates grew heavier. He started a youth group, a community outreach program, and most notably, the St. Jude's Visionary Fund, which later became the Building a Better Future Fund, and then simply the Building Fund. The names changed, but the goal was always the same: money. I should have seen the signs. The way his sermons started to sound more like fundraising pitches. The subtle shift in his pastoral calls, which began with inquiries about your soul and ended with inquiries about your estate planning. But I was grieving. My Robert had been gone for just over a year, and the silence in our big, beautiful house was a physical presence. The church was my sanctuary, my only real connection to the life we had built together. I suppose I was willing to overlook a great deal in exchange for that comfort. I donated, of course. I'd always been a significant benefactor to the church, something I did quietly, in Robert's and my name, a continuation of our shared life's purpose. But Reverend Michael had a knack for making you feel like your previous generosity was merely an appetizer for the main course he expected. The moment it all cracked open happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the stale, overheated air of his office. It was the anniversary of Robert's passing, and I felt a particular kind of fragility that day, a deep, gnawing loneliness that seemed to demand release. For decades I had carried a secret, a mistake I made not out of malice, but out of the desperate, clawing ambition of my youth. Long before I met Robert, long before I had any money to my name. It involved a zoning variance and a competitor's bid on a piece of land. I had received an anonymous tip about my competitor's sealed bid. A figure whispered over a crackling phone line, and in a moment of weakness I used it. I won the contract. That contract was the foundation of everything I later built. No one was ever prosecuted. The tip was never traced, and the competitor, a much larger firm, simply moved on to other projects. But the lie of it, the fundamental unfairness, had sat like a cold stone in my gut for over 40 years. I had spent a lifetime trying to build enough good in the world to outweigh that one bad act, and on that Tuesday, I decided it was time to finally give that stone to God. I went to confession, not in the formal wooden box, but in Michael's office, sitting in a worn leather chair, clutching a tissue. I told him everything: the desperation of being a young woman in a man's world, the fear of failure, the single terrible decision that had haunted me ever since. I cried. I felt the gut-wrenching shame of it all over again. He listened with that placid, beatific smile of his, nodding sympathetically. He murmured words of grace and forgiveness. He told me that God's love was a cleansing fire and that my confession had unburdened my soul. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I will hold this in the sacred trust of this office. Jillian, your secret is safe with me and with God." I left that office feeling lighter than I had in years. I felt clean. I felt free. The relief was intoxicating. For 1 week, I floated on that feeling, and then came the phone call. He asked me to stop by the parsonage, not the church office. He said it was about a private matter concerning the building fund. I thought nothing of it. I arrived at the lovely old Victorian house, the one Robert and I had spent a small fortune restoring before gifting it to the church. I sat in his living room, surrounded by furniture that was far too new and ostentatious for the historic home. He offered me tea. And then he started. He spoke about the rising costs of maintaining a historic building like St. Jude Isage. He spoke about his grand vision for a new community wing, a state-of-the-art media center for streaming services. He laid out a budget that was frankly astronomical, and then he paused, letting the silence hang in the air. He looked at me, his smile no longer warm, but thin, reptilian. "You know, Jillian," he said, "a woman of your standing in the community, your reputation for integrity is truly your most valuable asset. It would be a terrible shame if something were to tarnish it." He let the words hang there. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. He wouldn't. He continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A youthful mistake is one thing, but if the details of that old land deal were to become public knowledge now, well, people might misunderstand. They might question everything you've built, your philanthropy, your community awards. It could all be seen in a very different, very unflattering light." I just stared at him, my teacup rattling in its saucer. The feeling of relief I'd cherished all week curdled into pure, icy horror, the sacred trust, the cleansing fire. It was all a lie. He hadn't seen a penitent soul seeking grace. He had seen a wallet with a weakness. "A special donation, Jillian," he said, his voice now brisk, businesslike, a truly significant one. "Let's say $500,000 for the building fund. A gift of that magnitude would be a powerful testament to your good character. It would demonstrate a commitment that would make any old stories seem trivial. It would ensure that I continue to see you as the wonderful, generous woman you are, and that your secret remains just that, a secret." He thought he was blackmailing a guilt-ridden parishioner. He was standing in his living room, in a house he didn't own, trying to extort the woman who held his lease. The beautiful, historic church he preached in, the very floorboards he was standing on, they were all mine. Or rather, they belonged to a private preservation trust I had established 20 years ago, a trust of which I was the sole, an entirely anonymous trustee. He was trying to blackmail his own landlord, and as I sat there, paralyzed by the sheer blasphemous audacity of it all, I realized his eviction notice, citing a flagrant breach of the moral conduct clause in his housing agreement, was going to be an absolute pleasure to write. The light of that Sunday morning, I decided, was going to be very interesting indeed. The drive home from the parsonage is a blur. I remember the feel of the steering wheel, slick in my sweating palms. I remember the sickly sweet smell of the air freshener dangling from my rearview mirror, a little green pine tree that suddenly seemed to be mocking me, its artificial cheer a grotesque counterpoint to the acid churning in my stomach. The sacred had been made profane, a space I considered holy, the confessional, not the physical room, but the very concept of it, had been strip-mined for leverage. The cold, hard shock of it was a physical blow. It felt like the wind had been knocked out of me, but instead of my lungs emptying, it was my soul. I got inside my house, the house Robert and I had filled with so much laughter and love, and the silence I had found so oppressive before now felt like a tomb. I walked into Robert's study, a room I had mostly kept preserved, a museum to a man I adored. His books on architectural history lined the walls. His drafting tools lay neatly on his desk. On the credenza was a framed photo of us on our wedding day, standing on the steps of St. Jude's Sea, squinting in the bright sun. We were so young. I picked up the frame, my fingers tracing the outline of his smiling face. "What would you do, Robert?" I whispered to the empty room. But I already knew. Robert was a man of quiet strength and unshakable principles. He believed that institutions were only as strong as the integrity of the people who led them. He would have been heartbroken, and then he would have been furious. My mind spiraled back, not to the ugly conversation with Michael, but further to the reasons all of this existed in the first place. Robert and I didn't come from old money. We built our life together from the ground up. He was a brilliant, passionate architect specializing in historic preservation, and I had a sharp mind for business, a mind I had, in one dark moment, used unethically. After that youthful mistake, the one I had so foolishly confessed, I had vowed to live differently. When I met Robert a few years later, it was like my life finally found its true north. We shared a vision. We believed that a community's soul was held in its history, in its beautiful old buildings that told the story of who they were. We started a construction and restoration company that became our life's work. We were successful, more so than we ever dreamed, and we made a pact. A significant portion of everything we earned would go back into preserving the beauty we so cherished. St. Jude's was our heart project. It was a Gothic revival masterpiece, built in the 1880s, but by the time we were in our 40s, it was falling into disrepair. The diocese didn't have the money, and the congregation was shrinking. They were talking about selling the land to a developer who would tear it down and put up condominiums. The thought was a dagger to our hearts, so we acted. It took years of negotiation and a substantial portion of our fortune, but we didn't just donate money for repairs. We bought it, the entire property, the church, the parish hall, the sprawling grounds, and the dilapidated parsonage next door. But we knew that public philanthropy often breeds resentment, or worse, dependency. We didn't want a Holloway wing or a plaque with our names on it. Robert always said the building should be the hero of the story, not us, so we created the St. Jude's Preservation Trust. It was an entirely separate legal entity. We transferred the deeds of the properties to the trust. Then the trust drew up a long-term lease agreement with the church's governing body, the vestry. The terms were simple. They could use the property in perpetuity for the symbolic sum of $1 per year. In return, they had to adhere to two main covenants. First, they had to maintain the historical integrity of the buildings. No tearing down walls for a modern coffee bar. No replacing the stained glass with energy-efficient panes. Second, and this was Robert's most insistent point, was the moral conduct and leadership clause. He'd seen a hospital charity his father supported be bankrupted by an embezzling director, and the memory had left a permanent scar. The clause was ironclad. It stipulated that the appointed spiritual leader residing in the parsonage and serving the congregation must conduct themselves in both their public and private lives with the highest degree of ethical, moral, and legal integrity. Any act proven to be criminal, fraudulent, or constituting moral turpitude was grounds for an immediate and incurable breach of the lease agreement, giving the trust the right to terminate the occupancy of the parsonage, and if the vestry was complicit, the lease on the church itself. When we set it up, we named our lawyer and ourselves as the three trustees. After Robert passed, and then our lawyer, Arthur's father, retired, the bylaws we'd written stipulated that the trust would fall to a single, sole trustee, me. No one knew. Not the diocese, not the vestry, not a single soul in the congregation. They just knew their church was owned by a benevolent, anonymous trust that handled major capital repairs and asked for nothing in return. It was the perfect arrangement. It protected the church from developers and from incompetent or greedy leaders. It was Robert's greatest legacy. And now this slick, greedy little man was trying to use the sanctity of the church to defile it. Sitting there in Robert's study, the memory of that legal paperwork came rushing back. The weight of the vellum, the smell of the ink, the seriousness in Robert's eyes as he signed the documents. He was protecting his beloved church from a hypothetical future threat. He never could have imagined the threat would come from the pulpit itself, and that it would be aimed at me. The shock began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning fire in my chest. It started as a low ember of outrage, and was quickly fanned into a blaze of cold, hard fury. This wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on Robert's memory. It was a defilement of our life's work. The vulnerability I had felt in Michael's office evaporated, and in its place, something far stronger began to crystallize, resolve. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about justice. It was about stewardship. I was the guardian of St. Jude's, and a wolf had gotten into the sheepfold disguised as a shepherd. My duty was clear. I had to get him out. The catalyst that turned my resolve into a concrete plan came 3 days later. I had been ignoring Michael's calls, letting them go to voicemail. The messages became increasingly agitated. First, they were friendly reminders about our chat. Then they took on an edge of impatience. The final one, left on a Friday afternoon, was the one that sealed his fate. "Jillian, it's Michael. I'm beginning to feel you're not taking our conversation seriously." His voice had lost all its honeyed warmth. It was flat and cold. I believe I was clear. A commitment to the building fund is a commitment to your own peace of mind. I've been reviewing the church calendar. The bishop is visiting in 2 months. It would be a perfect time to announce a major new community project, funded by a leading parishioner. It would also be a time for many interesting conversations. Do not make me think that your youthful indiscretions have become your current defining character trait. I expect to hear from you by Monday, with a pledge: don't disappoint the Lord, or me. He didn't just threaten me, he threatened me with the full institutional weight of the church. He was going to use the bishop's visit as his stage. He was going to turn my atonement into a spectacle for his own gain. He invoked God's name in his sordid little shakedown. That was it. The line was crossed. The last vestige of my grief-stricken passivity burned away. I walked over to the heavy fireproof safe, hidden behind a false bookshelf in Robert's study, spun the combination lock, and pulled out the thick leather-bound folio that contained the founding documents of the St. Jude's Preservation Trust. I laid them on the desk, the official seal of the county clerk gleaming under the desk lamp. My name, Jillian Marie Halloway, was listed clearly as the sole acting trustee. I ran my fingers over the elegant, unforgiving language of the moral conduct clause. Moral turpitude, an act of vileness, baseness, or depravity in the private and social duties which a man owes to his fellow men, or to society in general, contrary to the accepted and customary rule of right and duty between man and man. That was the legal definition my lawyer had insisted on including. Blackmail fit the description perfectly. I picked up the phone. It was no longer about justice. It was no longer about stewardship. It was about cleansing the temple, and I knew exactly how I was going to do it. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. The first call I made was to Arthur Pembroke. Arthur is the son of the man who was our original lawyer, and he inherited both his father's practice and his razor-sharp mind. He's a generation younger than me, but he has the soul of an old-school legal brawler, hidden beneath a veneer of bespoke suits and quiet professionalism. He'd taken over the trust's legal affairs years ago, and was one of only 2 people on the planet who knew I was the anonymous landlord of St. Jude's. The other was my accountant. I met him at his downtown office, a place of quiet, expensive competence with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city park. I laid out the situation, my voice steady and devoid of the tears that had blurred the past week. I told him about the confession, the thinly veiled threat in the parsonage, and the final damning voicemail. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from polite concern to stony disbelief, and finally, to a kind of grim, focused rage that I recognized from his father. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute, just staring out the window. Then he turned back to me, his eyes glinting. "The unmitigated gall," he said, his voice quiet but seething. "To use the seal of the confessional for extortion. It's medieval. And to do it in a house he only occupies by your grace. The man is not only a predator, Gillian. He's a fool. I want him out, Arthur," I said simply. "Not just out of the parsonage. I want his influence gone. I want the church scrubbed clean of him." Arthur leaned forward. "All business now. The moral conduct clause is our weapon. It's beautifully, brutally clear. Robert was a genius for insisting on it. But we need to be smart. A public accusation of blackmail, without irrefutable proof, could get messy. He'll claim you're a vindictive old woman, that you misunderstood him, that you're mentally unstable from grief. He'll try to drag your name, and the church's name, through the mud." "I have the voicemail," I said. "It's good. It's very good." He nodded. "The implication is clear, but a defense attorney could argue he was simply being a zealous fundraiser. Don't disappoint, the Lord is slimy, but not explicitly criminal. We need something more. We need him to state his terms plainly. We need the quid pro quo in black and white." And so the plan began to form, not out of passion, but with the cold, meticulous precision of a military campaign. Arthur's advice was clear. I had to give Reverend Michael the opportunity to hang himself with his own rope. I had to meet with him again. The thought made my skin crawl, but I knew Arthur was right. I called Michael back. I feigned contrition and fear. My voice trembled. A trick I'd learned was surprisingly easy when you simply recall a moment of genuine terror. I told him I had been foolish to ignore him, that I was frightened, and that I wanted to discuss his proposal in person. I needed to understand what was required to ensure my continued good standing. We agreed to meet at the church, in a small, rarely used prayer chapel at the back of the building. It felt safer than his office or the parsonage. Before I went, Arthur equipped me. He gave me a small, discreet digital recorder, no bigger than a car key fob. "Just click it on when you get there and put it in your coat pocket," he instructed. "Don't fuss with it. Let him talk. Play the part of the cornered, frightened widow. Let his arrogance be his undoing. That meeting was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. I sat on a hard wooden bench, the scent of old hymnals and lemon polish in the air. Michael arrived, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He clearly believed he had broken me. "Jillian, I'm so glad you've come to your senses," he began, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Reverend," I started, my voice a carefully constructed quaver. "I've been thinking about what you said, about my reputation. I've worked so hard, I can't lose it all now." "Of course not," he said smoothly, sitting beside me, his proximity feeling like a violation. "And God wouldn't want you to. He wants you to share your blessings. The building fund is the perfect vehicle for your penance." "The amount you mentioned," I whispered, $500,000. "It's a lot of money." "It's a lot of security," he corrected me. "Think of it as an investment, an insurance policy against unfortunate revelations. Once the donation is made, my memory of our little chat in the office becomes hazy. The Lord's forgiveness, facilitated by your generosity, will be absolute. Your secret will be safe forever. With me." There it was. The quid pro quo, the explicit link between the money and his silence. It was all I needed. I told him I would need to talk to my financial advisor to arrange the transfer of funds. He smiled, patted my hand, and told me not to take too long. As I walked out of that chapel, the little device in my pocket felt as heavy and as powerful as a loaded gun. But Arthur and I knew that evicting him was only part of the solution. Michael had supporters on the vestry, people who were taken in by his charm. If we simply had a process server show up, he could spin it as a personal vendetta from a mysterious, faceless landlord. We needed to erode his power base from within. We needed an ally inside the church government. We needed Agnes Carmichael. Agnes was the church treasurer. She was a retired CPA in her early 70s, a woman with a mind like a steel trap and a zero-tolerance policy for nonsense. She and I had served on the flower committee together for 20 years. She was pragmatic, devout in a quiet, no-fuss sort of way, and she had been grumbling to me for months about Reverend Michael's financial practices. She didn't like the way he was using the discretionary fund, the lack of transparent receipts for his community outreach expenses, and his obsession with the ever-growing, ever-nebulous building fund. I invited Agnes for lunch at a quiet restaurant far from the church. I didn't lay all my cards on the table at once. I started by asking about her concerns with the church's finances. That opened the floodgates. "It's a mess, Jillian, a complete mess," she said, pushing her salad around her plate. "He treats the church's accounts like his personal slush fund. There are conference fees for events that I can't find any record of, consulting charges from companies that seem to lead back to his brother-in-law. And this building fund, he's the only one with full access to the account. He says it's for donor privacy. I say it's for a lack of oversight. I've tried to bring it up at vestry meetings, but he's so charming. He makes me sound like a fussy old bean counter who doesn't understand his grand vision." I let her vent, and then I leaned in. "Agnes, what if I told you that the trust that owns the church property has concerns?" Her eyes sharpened. "The trust? No one ever hears from the trust. They just send a check when the roof leaks." "They're watching," I said carefully. "They've become aware of potential irregularities in the church's leadership. They're considering a formal audit of the lease covenants." Agnes put her fork down. "A lease audit? What would that entail?" "It would entail a full review of all financial records, but also a review of the leadership's adherence to the moral conduct clauses in the agreement." A slow smile spread across Agnes's face. "Moral conduct clauses. My, That could be illuminating. I need you, Agnes, I said, finally showing my hand. The trust needs someone on the inside, someone who can get their hands on the financial statements, the receipts, the bank records for that building fund. We need to see how deep this rot goes. I still hadn't told her that I was the trust. I framed it as me being a concerned parishioner who had a contact with the trust's lawyers. It was a lie of omission, but a necessary one for the moment. I needed her help as a fellow church member, not as someone acting on my personal behalf. Agnes didn't hesitate. "Consider it done," she said, her voice firm. "I've been praying for a way to bring some accountability to that man. It seems my prayers have been answered, just not in a way I expected." The plan was now a three-pronged attack. I had the direct evidence of his blackmail attempt. Agnes would provide the evidence of his financial malfeasance, creating a pattern of unethical behavior, and Arthur would wield the legal instrument of the trust to execute the final blow. We spent the next 2 weeks in a quiet flurry of activity. Arthur transcribed the recording of my meeting with Michael and had it notarized. Agnes, using her authority as treasurer, began discreetly copying years of financial records. She uncovered what she called a breathtaking pattern of self-enrichment: lavish dinners disguised as donor cultivation meetings, first-class airfare for church business, even payments to a tailor for his custom-made suits, filed under vestment maintenance. The building fund was the worst. He had set it up with an out-of-state bank, and it was structured more like a personal investment account than a nonprofit fund. There were significant withdrawals with no corresponding invoices or explanations. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. The evidence was now a mountain. Arthur drafted the formal eviction notice for the parsonage and a separate, more detailed letter to the vestry. The eviction notice was for Michael, citing the breach of the moral conduct clause due to acts of extortion. The letter to the vestry would lay out everything: the blackmail attempt, supported by the transcript of the recording, and the financial crimes, supported by the documents Agnes had uncovered. It would also, for the first time, reveal my identity as the sole trustee. It was crucial, Arthur argued, that they understood this wasn't an attack from an outsider, but a necessary cleansing from within. The final piece of the plan was the delivery. Arthur suggested a simple registered letter. I said no. A letter could be hidden, denied, spun. Michael's power was in his public performance, his carefully crafted image of piety and authority. That was where he had to be dismantled. "I want it delivered on Sunday," I told Arthur, in the middle of his sermon. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "That's theatrical, Jillian." The man turned my confession into theater. I replied, my voice hard as iron, "He deserves to have his fall from grace, be just as public. I want every single person in that church to see that piece of paper placed in his hand. I want them to see the look on his face when his world comes crashing down. There will be no spin. There will be only the silent, undeniable truth of his downfall." Arthur was quiet for a moment, then a slow, admiring smile spread across his face. "All right, Jillian. Theatrical it is." He made a note on his legal pad. "Hire process server. Sunday morning, 10:15 a.m. sharp." The silent takeover began not with a bang, but with a single perfectly crafted letter. It was Arthur's opening salvo, a masterpiece of understated menace. He sent it via courier to the church, addressed to the senior warden of the vestry, with copies sent to Reverend Michael and Agnes Carmichael. The letter was from the law firm of Pembroke and Associates, acting on behalf of the St. Jude's Preservation Trust. It was dry, formal, and utterly chilling. It stated that the trust was invoking its right, as per Section 4B of the lease agreement, to conduct a comprehensive audit of the church's financial records and operational governance. It specifically requested full, uncensored access to all accounts associated with church operations, including any and all special fundraising vehicles like the building fund. It also noted that the audit would include a review of leadership compliance with the Moral Conduct Clause. The letter didn't mention blackmail. It didn't mention me. It was a simple bureaucratic request that landed with the force of a grenade. The fallout was immediate. Agnes called me that evening, her voice a mixture of exhilaration and nerves. You should have seen his face, Jillian. He went white as a sheet. He tried to play it off, of course, called it a routine inquiry from our generous but fussy benefactors. But the rest of the vestry, they're spooked. They've never heard from the trust like this before. 2 hours later, my own phone rang. It was Michael. The honey was gone from his voice, replaced by a frantic, buzzing rage. Jillian, what did you do? He hissed into the phone. Did you complain to someone? Did you send some anonymous letter? I have lawyers crawling all over me because of some ridiculous audit. It took every ounce of my self-control not to laugh out loud. The sheer magnificent irony of it. He was accusing me of going behind his back to cause trouble, the very thing he was punishing me for not letting him do. He still had no idea. He thought some anonymous third party was making his life difficult, and he was furious that his cash cow might be scared off. I don't know what you're talking about, Reverend, I said, my voice pitched to sound frail and confused. Lawyers? An audit? Oh dear, that sounds dreadful. Don't play dumb with me, he snapped. This is because you've been dragging your feet. This is what happens when you don't show the proper gratitude. This is a test from God, and you are failing it spectacularly. You need to fix this. You tell whoever you complain to that everything is fine, and that generous donation we discussed, the one for 500,000, it's 750,000 now. Consider it a fine for the trouble you've caused. That should make this audit go away. I just held the phone, listening to his frantic, greedy demands. He was now trying to get me to bribe my own trust, through my own lawyer, to stop an audit that I myself had initiated. The man was a snake eating its own tail, and I had it all on tape. I calmly said, I'll have to think about it, Reverend, and hung up the phone. I immediately called Arthur. He just did it again, I said, a smile finally breaking across my face. He raised the price. Oh, this is better than Christmas, Arthur chuckled. The man is a gift that keeps on giving. We now have him on tape, twice, attempting to extort you, with escalating demands. Any jury in the country would convict him. Meanwhile, Agnes was working her own magic on the inside. She called an emergency meeting of the vestry's finance committee. With the trust's audit letter as her shield, she presented the litany of financial irregularities she had been tracking for months. The other committee members, a retired banker and a local business owner, were horrified. They had been charmed by Michael's content to let him handle the finances with what they assumed was integrity. Agnes's meticulous records, the receipts from high-end restaurants, the unexplained cash withdrawals, the consulting fees to his relatives, painted a starkly different picture. The panic on the vestry began to set in. They were the fiduciaries. They were legally responsible for the church's finances. If the trust's audit found evidence of embezzlement, they could be held liable. Michael's charm was suddenly no match for the fear of a lawsuit. His support on the board began to evaporate like mist in the morning sun. He must have sensed it. He must have felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. His calls to me stopped. In their place came a new strategy. He decided to take his case to the court of public opinion, the congregation. The following Sunday, he stepped up to the pulpit. his face arranged in an expression of sorrowful gravitas. His sermon was not from the lectionary. It was a fiery, emotional tirade about the trials of leadership. He spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing and the whispers of slander that seek to divide a flock. He didn't use names, but every eye in that church knew who he was talking about. He was painting a picture of himself as a righteous man under attack from dark, unnamed forces. He was trying to poison the well, to inoculate the congregation against the truth he knew was coming. He spoke of a disgruntled parishioner with a troubled soul who was spreading lies to avoid her Christian duty. He hinted at a cabal of naysayers on the vestry who lacked the vision to see the glorious future he had planned. It was a masterful performance of manipulative victimhood. I sat in my usual pew, my hands clasped calmly in my lap, and I watched him. I felt a strange sense of pity for him. He was like a man in a locked room, frantically trying to board up the windows, not realizing the walls themselves were about to be knocked down. He thought the battle was for the hearts and minds of the congregation. He had no idea the war was already lost, the documents already signed, the verdict already rendered. His performance, meant to shore up his support, had the opposite effect. It was unseemly. It was desperate. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The sermon felt less like a message from God and more like a political attack ad. He was losing them, and he didn't even know it. The silent takeover was nearly complete. The foundation was rotten, the walls were trembling, and all that was left was to give the final push. The shift in the church was subtle at first, like a change in the weather that you feel in your bones before you see the clouds gather. The Sunday after Reverend Michael's sermon about the vipers in our midst, the atmosphere in the sanctuary was palpably different. The usual cheerful chatter before the service was replaced by hushed whispers. People weren't making eye contact. There was a tension, a sense of shared unease that hung in the air thicker than incense. Michael's sermon had backfired spectacularly. Instead of rallying the congregation to his side, it had confirmed the whispers that had started to leak out from the vestry. People knew something was wrong. They didn't know the details, but they knew there was conflict, and the pastor's paranoid, self-pitying tirade had made it clear who the source of that conflict was. I saw it in the faces of people I had known my whole life. Margaret, who ran the Sunday school, gave me a look that was a mixture of worry and solidarity. Old Mr. Henderson, who had been an usher for 40 years, gave me a short, sharp nod as I walked to my pew, a gesture that said, "I'm with you." They didn't know my secret. They didn't know about the trust or the blackmail, but they knew me, they knew my character, and they were beginning to seriously question his. The most visible sign of the power shift was in the collection plates. Agnes told me later that the Sunday after his Viper sermon, the collection was down by nearly 40%. It was a silent, powerful protest. This congregation, a group of mostly practical, hard-working people, expressed their confidence not with applause, but with the crisp rustle of dollar bills, and their silence was deafening. This visible erosion of his support sent Michael into a new level of panic. He saw his power base, his moral authority, and the congregation's adoration crumbling before his eyes. And like a cornered animal, he became reckless. He tried to reassert his dominance through brute force. He called another emergency vestry meeting, this time with the intent of removing Agnes from her position as treasurer. He accused her of financial insubordination and sowing discord. Agnes, bless her steadfast heart, was prepared. She had shared her findings with the other members of the finance committee, who now stood with her. When Michael made his motion to remove her, it was met with a stony silence. The senior warden, a man named George, finally spoke up. "Reverend," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment, I think the person who needs to answer some questions here is not Agnes, it's you. We have seen her records, we have seen the audit letter from the trust. We need some straight answers about the building fund. Michael, for the first time, was publicly challenged by his own board. According to Agnes, his face went from red to purple. He sputtered about his authority, about their lack of faith, about the sacred mission they were jeopardizing. But the spell was broken. They were no longer his acolytes. They were worried fiduciaries staring down the barrel of a legal and financial disaster. The meeting ended with the vestry voting to freeze the building fund account and to cooperate fully with the trust's audit. It was a complete and utter repudiation of his leadership. His desperate countermove had failed. His authority within the church's governance was shattered. He had only one card left to play, the secret he held over me. He thought it was his ace in the hole. He was about to find out it was a joker. The final pieces of my own plan were now falling into place with the quiet, inexorable click of a well-oiled machine. Arthur had the legal documents prepared. The eviction notice was a thing of brutal simplicity. It stated that Reverend Michael Davies was in incurable breach of the parsonage lease agreement. Citing Section 7, the Moral Conduct Clause, it gave him 30 days to vacate the premises. The accompanying letter to the vestry was more detailed, laying out the full story, complete with the notarized transcript of the second recording and Agnes's damning financial summary. It would be delivered to the senior warden at the same time the eviction notice was delivered to Michael. There would be no room for him to spin a narrative. The facts would speak for themselves. The last piece was the messenger. Arthur had hired a professional process server, a man named Mr. Gable. I met him once, briefly, in Arthur's office. He was a tall, unnervingly calm man, with pale eyes and an air of quiet finality. He looked less like a legal functionary and more like an undertaker. He was perfect. Arthur briefed him meticulously. You will enter the sanctuary at precisely 10:15 a.m. through the north side door. You will walk directly down the center aisle to the pulpit. You will not speak. You will place this envelope on the lectern, directly in front of Reverend Davies. Then you will turn, walk back down the aisle, and exit the church. Is that understood? Mr. Gable simply nodded. Understood. The night before that final Sunday felt like the night before a major surgery, a necessary, terrifying procedure to excise a cancer. I barely slept. I sat in Robert's study, holding the photo from our wedding day. I was not the same woman in that picture. That young woman was full of hope and a touch of naivete. The woman I was now was a warrior. I had been tested by grief, and now I was being tested by greed. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was doing the right thing. I was protecting our legacy. I was protecting our church. I was protecting the light. That Sunday morning, I got dressed with deliberate care. I chose a simple navy blue dress and the pearl necklace Robert had given me on our 25th anniversary. I felt a profound sense of calm. The storm was about to break, but I was in its quiet, steady eye. I drove to church, parked in my usual spot, and walked up the stone steps of St. Jude, the beautiful, flawed, beloved building that was in the end my responsibility and my weapon. The Sunday arrived, cool and clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. As I walked into the sanctuary, the morning light was streaming through the stained glass depiction of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, casting vibrant splashes of ruby and sapphire across the stone floor. The irony was not lost on me. I took my seat in my usual pew, the smooth, worn oak familiar beneath my hand. The organ was playing a soft prelude, but the notes couldn't quite mask the palpable tension in the room. The congregation was smaller than usual, but those who were there seemed to be holding their collective breath. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. I saw Agnes a few rows ahead. She turned slightly, caught my eye, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Reverend Michael ascended the steps to the high pulpit. He looked haggard. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defiant anger. He gripped the sides of the lectern, his knuckles white. He surveyed the congregation, his gaze sweeping over us, not with love, but with accusation. His eyes lingered on me for a second, and in them I saw a flash of pure venom. He still believed he held all the power. He thought my secret was his shield. He began his sermon. It was a continuation of the previous week's theme, but angrier, more unhinged. He railed against the sin of gossip and the arrogance of those who would judge a man of God. He was building to a crescendo of self-righteous fury, preparing to paint himself as a martyr. There are those among us, he declared, his voice booming with false piety, who have secrets in their hearts, sins they have hidden for years. And when a man of God, in his mercy, offers them a path to redemption, a way to cleanse their tarnished reputations through generosity, they repay that mercy with betrayal. He was talking about me. He was about to use the pulpit to expose me, to use the secret I had confessed in a moment of sacred trust as a weapon to destroy my name and save himself. I felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly extinguished by a cold, righteous calm. Let him talk. Let him dig his own grave a little deeper. And then, at precisely 10:15, the heavy oak door at the back of the sanctuary opened. A sliver of bright sunlight cut through the dim interior. Framed in the doorway was Mr. Gable. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, a man utterly devoid of drama, which made his presence all the more dramatic. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a soft final thud. A murmur went through the congregation. Heads turned. The organist, sensing the shift, let the notes of the hymn fade into silence. Every eye in the building was now on the silent, impassive stranger. Michael faltered. His ranting sermon died in his throat. He stared, his mouth slightly agape, as Mr. Gable began his long, slow walk down the center aisle. His footsteps were the only sound in the cavernous church, a steady, rhythmic cadence on the stone floor. It was the sound of an appointment being kept. Mr. Gable did not look at the congregation. He did not look at me. His pale eyes were fixed on one man and one man only. He walked with an unhurried, inexorable purpose, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or denied. He reached the chancel steps and ascended them without breaking stride. Michael shrank back from the lectern, as if Mr. Gable were carrying a viper. He looked from the stranger to the senior warden, to the congregation, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into terror. Mr. Gable stopped directly in front of the pulpit. He reached into his jacket and produced a single thick 9x12 manila envelope. He did not say a word. He simply placed the envelope on the lectern, squarely on top of Michael's sermon notes. Then he turned, descended the steps, and walked back down the aisle with the same deliberate pace, exiting the church as silently as he had entered. The entire event took less than 90 seconds. The silence he left behind was absolute. It was a profound, ringing silence, heavy with meaning and dread. Every person in that church, including Reverend Michael, seemed to be frozen in time. He stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. His breathing was shallow, ragged. His face, which had been flushed with anger, was now a pasty, sickly white. With a trembling hand, he reached out and picked it up. His fingers fumbled with the clasp. He pulled out the documents within. I watched him read. I saw the flicker of his eyes across the page. I saw the moment his brain processed the words eviction notice. I saw the dawning incomprehension, the flicker of confusion as he scanned the legal language about the breach of the lease. And then I saw the exact second he read the signature block at the bottom, the part where the letter to the vestry, a copy of which was included, was signed by me, Gillian Halloway, as sole trustee of the St. Jude's Preservation Trust. His head snapped up. His wild, panicked eyes scanned the congregation until they found mine, and in that moment, all the pieces fell into place for him. The anonymous trust, the moral conduct clause, the audit. Me. It wasn't a disgruntled parishioner. It wasn't a faceless landlord. It was the woman he had tried to blackmail. He knew, and he knew that I knew that he knew. The carefully constructed world of Reverend Michael Davies shattered into a million pieces right there in front of 200 witnesses. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a ghastly shade of gray. His arrogance, his piety, his rage, it all collapsed, leaving only the raw, naked terror of a con man who has just been exposed. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held his gaze, my expression calm, my heart filled, not with triumph, but with a profound and sorrowful sense of justice. My victory wasn't in his humiliation. It was in the silence, in the reclamation of this sacred space. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. A choked, gurgling noise escaped his throat. He stumbled back from the pulpit, knocking over a glass of water, which shattered on the stone floor. The sound echoed through the silent church like a gunshot. Then Agnes Carmichael stood up. Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the paralyzed silence. "This service is concluded," she announced. "The vestry will hold an immediate and closed emergency meeting in the parish hall. Please, go in peace." It was over. The charade was over. The man who had held my soul for ransom had been rendered speechless, powerless, undone by his own greed, in the very place he had used as his stage. And as the congregation began to rise, murmuring in a state of collective shock, I finally allowed myself to take a full, deep breath. The light pouring through the stained glass windows seemed, for the first time in a long time, to be clean again. The weeks that followed were a quiet whirlwind of necessary change. The vestry meeting, as you can imagine, was short and decisive. Faced with my letter, the notarized transcript of the recordings, Agnes's financial evidence, and the undeniable reality of the eviction notice, the board voted unanimously to terminate Reverend Michael's employment for cause, effective immediately. There was no severance, no golden parachute, just a box for his personal belongings and the cold shoulder of a community he had betrayed. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. The evidence was too overwhelming. He was gone from the parsonage within a week, loading his garish furniture into a moving truck in the dead of night, like a thief slipping away. I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved back in with his sister in another state. His career in the clergy was finished. The story, while we tried to keep it contained to protect the church itself, had a way of seeping out through the denominational network. No other church would have him. He had profaned the sacred, and for that there is no easy redemption. He got precisely what his actions had earned him, a legacy of shame and a future of obscurity. For St. Jude, et Poisem, it was a time of healing. I finally revealed my role as the trustee to the full vestry. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed not by resentment, but by a wave of profound gratitude. They understood I had acted not for myself, but for the good of the institution we all loved. We worked together to bring in an interim pastor, a wonderful semi-retired woman named Reverend Elizabeth, who had a gentle spirit and a gift for listening. Her sermons weren't about money or grand visions. They were about grace, forgiveness, and the quiet work of mending a wounded community. And as for my special donation, I did make one, the full $500,000 that Michael had first demanded. I gave it to the church with a single stipulation, that it be used to establish a community fund, overseen by a committee that included Agnes, to provide free counseling and support services. My thinking was that if one person's faith could be so abused, there were likely others in our community nursing quieter wounds. It was my way of turning his poison into a cure. It was my way of truly cleansing the temple. Now I sit here in Robert's study, and I look at that photo of us on our wedding day, and I think about the nature of secrets. Reverend Michael saw my secret as a weakness, a lever he could use to pry open my life and take what he wanted. He believed that what is hidden is always a source of shame, but he was wrong. Sometimes our secrets are not our weaknesses, but our strengths. My secret wasn't the foolish mistake I made in my youth. It was the quiet, steady promise I had made with my husband to protect something beautiful. My secret was the trust. My secret was my power. He thought he could exploit my past, but he never understood that I had already spent a lifetime building a future that was stronger than any mistake. Vulnerability is not an invitation for exploitation. Faith is not a commodity to be bought and sold. And the walls of a church should be a sanctuary from the predators of the world, not a hunting ground for them. I learned that the hard way, but I also learned that one determined person, armed with the truth and a well-drafted legal document, can still cast out the money changers and restore a little bit of sanctity to a world that desperately needs it. It wasn't about revenge in the end. It was about reminding one man, and perhaps myself, that some things are not for sale. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope that if you ever find yourself in a position where someone is trying to use your own goodness against you, you remember that your integrity is your greatest strength. Please share your own stories of standing up for what's right in the comments below. Your experiences give strength to others. And of course, if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice being served. Every story shared is a light in the darkness. Thank you.